because we're not just throwing the main body, the main vessel on the wheel, but you guys in a different class are also going to be working on the spout and the lid and the handle, and those are all opportunities to get really funky and creative with your design. So even if you're not 100% maybe satisfied with how it came out on the wheel, you can still make it look really beautiful with those other details. So this, what I'm using right here, is about a pound of clay. That should get you, kind of a regular teapot size, something like this. If you want to go a little smaller, you absolutely can. Before you jump on the wheel, what I did earlier today was I wedged this. Has anyone ever heard of wedging before? Okay, great. So that's basically where you kind of go like this, kind of pushing it forward and around with your palms, kind of getting it to rotate over itself to pop any air bubbles, because if there are any air bubbles and then you put it in the kiln, the heat wants to expand and it's going to explode, or at the very least crack. So you definitely always want to wedge your clay. The thing about wedging is as you're rotating it, it creates a grain, kind of the same way that wood has a grain. So you'll notice when you wedge it, it kind of creates this spiral on the side. That means that the grain is going this way because that's how we were rotating it. So when you have your ball of clay and you go to put it on the wheel, you want that spiral to be facing the ceiling. You want it to be straight up. You don't want to put it down sideways, because then when you start to turn the wheel, oops, yeah, don't do that. When you start to turn the wheel, you're going against the grain and it'll be a lot harder to center, and centering is the next step. All right, so now that we got all the air bubbles out, we want to make sure that the clay is secure to the wheel. So don't be shy, you really want to slam it down to make sure it's going to stick. We want to make sure that the clay's in the center. If you look at the tip of the top of these wheels, it has the lines kind of engraved into the metal. That's a great tool you can use visually to make sure your clay is in the middle of the wheel, because the more in the middle it is now, the easier centering will be. So I'm just going to scoot this over a little bit so that it's inside of that smallest circle. Centering requires a lot of pressure, and sometimes the clay can pop off, and when that happens, it's just really annoying. So I would recommend taking your fingers and just pushing down along that bottom edge just to help it blend into the wheel head and to make it feel more secure. If your clay is kind of a lumpy shape, I would recommend giving it just a couple little pats to make it nice and smooth, and also double check that it's a circular shape. So I'm just going to pat, pat, pat all the way around, and this will just make the future steps easier. We want the sides to be flat and we want the top to be flat, and just making sure it's a nice cylinder shape. Okay, so now we can take our sponge and cover this with water. Don't be shy with the water, cover the whole thing. So now with centering, we don't want to go too fast and we don't want to go too slow. So it's definitely worth spending a little bit of time getting a good speed here. Let's do a little fast. That's pretty good. Because if you go too slow, nothing's going to happen. You're going to lose the symmetry, but if you go too fast, you lose control. So what we want to do with our hands is we want to get them nice and wet. We want our non-dominant hand to be pushing in on the side of the clay, dominant hand on the top pushing down. We also want to keep our elbows on our legs for stability. So with your non-dominant hand, you're going to be using the very base of your palm pushing in on the side. With your dominant hand, you can either make a fist or kind of a karate chop shape like this. It doesn't really matter. We're just using this part of our hand to push down. Again, we want to be nice and still, so keep your elbows on your legs, bottom of your non-dominant hand on the side pushing in, bottom of your dominant palm on the top pushing down. So gently pushing in and gently pushing down with equal pressure. The reason why we want to keep our elbows on our legs is because if you're just floating and the clay is uneven, the clay is going to push you around and we'll be here all day. The clay can be really powerful when it's uncentered. So that's why you want to have that nice stable connection point. So I'm going to go in with my non-dominant hand first, gently pushing in, dominant hand on top, gently pushing down. It might look like I'm using a lot of pressure. I'm actually not. I'm being very gentle because if you push too hard, you can actually make it more wobbly. And you'll notice my wrists are touching. That will just give you some extra stability. So if you're right-handed, you want this part of your left hand to be at 7 o'clock. If you're left-handed, you want this part of your right hand to be at 5 o'clock. So this is one technique, and it just takes a little bit of patience to get it perfectly centered. But if you guys are in the mood to try something else, another technique you can do is using this part, kind of the top part of both of your palms at 6 o'clock, so have your palms touching, and if you push forward, that can help to straighten it out and center it as well. So you can do this for maybe 30 seconds or so. We don't want it to get too skinny and too tall. So after doing this for a little while, then I would recommend going back to the original position to push it back down a little bit because we don't want it to get too tall. So the way you know you're centered is if you take your dominant fingers, gently rest them at 3 o'clock if you're a righty, 9 o'clock if you're a lefty, and if your fingers feel still, you're good to go. But if you see or feel any wobbling with your fingers, then you want to keep centering. So let's just get that centered again. And let's do the finger test. So see the difference? Yeah, now my fingers are still on the side. I will say centering is really hard. Don't do that. For a lot of people, it's the hardest step. So if you feel like it's taking you a pretty long amount of time to do it, don't beat yourself up. It is a really hard thing to practice, but I think it's definitely worth it. If you want to double check making sure it's nice and smooth, you can take any straight wooden tool and you can get it nice and wet. And if you push that into the side, satisfying, that just makes it really straight. So if you're a perfectionist, you can definitely use a tool to help you out. Any questions about how to get the clay centered? Okay. The last thing I'll say about centering is you do kind of want to consider what type of teapot you want to make. If you want to make a lower, kind of wider shaped teapot, you want to pay attention to the width of the bottom because everything is going to grow from this point. So you might consider pushing the shade down a little bit to give you a nice wide bottom. On the other hand, if you want the style of your teapot to be skinnier and taller, then you can use your hands to push that back in if you want a skinnier, taller teapot. Because the next step is making the hole, and once we hollow this out, there's no way to go back and change that. I mean, you can, but it's really hard. So just pay attention to the shape and if it kind of aligns with your vision for what you want your teapot to be. Okay, so now we can make the hole. I'm going to take my dominant finger, I'm going to start at 6 o'clock, I'm going to gently push down and then slowly move forward. When I get to the center, I'm going to let go and repeat. So starting on the rim at 6 o'clock, gently pushing down, slowly moving forward. And what this does is it creates a V shape in the top of the clay, and the helpful thing about that is not only can you see the center, but you'll also be able to feel the exact center with your fingers. Because the thing is, if your hole is not exactly in the middle, if it's not exactly in the center of the clay, one side of your teapot is going to be thicker than the other, and or it will be wobbly. So that's why we want to make sure everything is symmetrical. So 6 o'clock, taking my finger, pushing down, gently, slowly moving forward. So now we know the deepest part of that indent is exactly where I want to stick my thumb down to make the hole. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So we always want to be stable, so I'm going to keep my elbow on my leg, dominant thumb. You don't have to, but I would recommend resting your palm against the side of the clay just to help keep your hand still. Thumb on top of that indent we made. I have seen some people try to make their hole like this. a lot of times what happens is your thumb and your whole hand will start wobbling, and then you might have to start over. So being in this position will help prevent that from happening. A little bit more water on there, and then just slowly going down to make your hole. We don't want to go all the way through the bottom of the clay. We want the bottom to be around 1/4 of an inch. If it's too thick, it's going to be really, really heavy, and if it's too thin, it might crack. So around 1/4 of an inch is perfect. So how do we measure that? You can take your needle tool, stick it all the way through the clay until it touches the wheel head, then take your finger and stick it in until it touches the clay, lift up at the same time. That's okay. It could be a little thinner. I think I'm gonna go down like 1 more millimeter. Oh my God. Okay, let's see. We want it to be around 1/4 of an inch. Okay, perfect. Can everyone see that? If you're nervous about this step, it's always safer to be on the thicker side, because if you have to, you can kind of shave it down with the tool later. But if it's too thin, it's a lot harder to re-thicken it, and if it cracks, then we can't have our tea party. That would just be so sad. Any questions about how to make the hole? Okay. So now that we have our depth, we can focus on the width and making the hole wider. So again, just kind of finding a medium speed here. All you have to do is just take your dominant thumb, stick it all the way back in, keep your elbow on your leg. If you're right-handed, slowly pulling it out towards 3 o'clock, left-handed 9 o'clock. So thumb all the way in there, and then just slowly pushing it outwards. The most important thing you want to remember when you're making the hole wider is we don't want the width of the hole to get wider than the width of the bottom of the clay. Does that make sense to everybody? Because if this hole gets too wide, it gets really thin right here, and then the clay rips off. And because of all the water we're using, you can't re-stick it, you just have to start over. This step is a lot funner than it looks. Like, it really is satisfying stretching the clay out, and a lot of people get carried away. So just kind of watch yourself and make sure you're not bringing it out too far. So I would recommend leaving about 1 inch of space, so about 1 inch thickness of clay, to make sure you don't make it too thin. Before we move on to the next step, we just want to double check the shape of everything. You know how when you look inside of a bowl, it has that kind of swooped shape, or the floor, the bottom meets the wall? Anytime you're making a vertical shape on the wheel, we want it to be a 90-degree angle. And there's 2 reasons for this. The first reason is it'll make your piece feel lighter in the end. And the second reason is it's easier to grab more clay and bring it upwards. So it's a little thing that makes a big difference. So to straighten that edge on the bottom, all you have to do is take your finger and just kind of stick it in there and just push outwards a little bit just to sharpen it. If anyone wants to come a little closer to take a look on the inside, you're more than welcome to. Come on, take a look, somebody. Am I the only one who's gonna be hurt?
I'll look at it.
You just zoom in.
Yeah.
So nice and sharp in there.
Ooh.
It's a little thing that makes a big difference.
Yippee.
Thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
I feel better. Okay, so now for the fun part, we can actually start going upwards. And the thing about pottery is there's a lot of different ways to do multiple things. I'm just going to show you guys the very traditional way, but in the future, if you realize there are other things that work better for you, you're more than welcome to try them. Just because we all have different hands and we all have different, feels for things. But the way I was taught, the traditional way, is using the tips or the pads of our middle fingers. If you want to use multiple fingers, you can, but your middle fingers are going to be the best option here. So you want to keep your elbows on your legs because, again, we want to have that stability. We want to make sure our fingers are level as we're pulling up the piece, because if one of your fingers is on top of the other or in front of the other, what happens is it makes the clay very uneven, and then it wobbles, and it might get so wobbly that it rips and gets a hole. So we want to have consistency and uniformity in the thickness. So elbows on my legs, Fingers I'm making sure are together. We want to start all the way on the bottom, and we want to squeeze with equal pressure, but we don't want to squeeze too hard. It's kind of like a gentle hug. And then just slowly working your way up the clay. And then when you get to the rim, just be a little bit extra gentle and then just slowly let go. So elbows on my legs, starting on the bottom. Fingers are level, meaning they're the same, they're facing each other. Gently squeezing, equal pressure. And then just slowly going up 1 millimeter at a time. There's no rush. And you guys will notice as I'm pulling that my thumbs are interlocked. That's optional, but I personally really like it because it makes me feel more stable. But if you want to throw like this, you totally can. The reason why we want to move up so slowly is because we need the wheel to make at least one full rotation before we move our fingers upward, meaning we want the wheel to spin at least one full circle before you go up, because if your hands are moving faster than the wheel, the clay can't catch up to what you're doing to it, and then you lose the symmetry and then it starts to wobble, or some parts get thinner than others and then it rips. What is that noise?
That's the bell.
I thought class already started.
There's lunch.
Oh, okay. It's like interrupting me and like throwing me off. Okay. That's just a little too fast. I'm going to slow back down a little bit. So you can see, slowly but surely, with every pull, we're starting to get taller and taller. So one more time, elbows on my legs, starting on the bottom, fingers are together, very, very gently squeezing with equal pressure, and then 1 millimeter at a time, slowly going up these walls. Every once in a while, it's good to double check the lip. The lip meaning the rim of the piece. Because sometimes when you're throwing and you're in the zone and you get so in the flow, you kind of forget about the rim, and then sometimes it can get really thin, and it might get so thin that it rips off. So I would say every 10 pulls or so, pulls meaning doing this with your fingers, you want to double check the rim. How do you do that? Well, there's something called compressing the rim. Compressing the rim is when you take your non-dominant index finger and thumb at 6 o'clock, finger inside of the hole, thumb on the outside. Can everyone see that? So just like this. Dominant finger, we're going to put on top and in between those two fingers, and that compresses the rim and re-thickens it. So gently squeezing and then gently pushing down, and that will help you make your piece taller, and it will help to keep it nice and neat. Okay. So this is the point where we want to start to think about the shaping. Actually, before we talk about shaping, does anyone have any questions about actually pulling up the walls? I'll just do it one more time. Elbows on your legs. If you're right-handed, you want to be at 3 o'clock. If you're left-handed, you want to be at 9 o'clock. Fingers are together, starting as low as you can. They're equal. Very, very gently squeezing. Slowly going up. Oh, something I should mention is if you notice a wobble is starting to develop, don't panic. There are things you can do to smooth it back out. I think the easiest method is getting your palms nice and wet, using the top part of your palms at 4 o'clock and 8 o'clock, wrap your fingers around the piece, and if you have any wobbles, just by giving it a little hug, you can kind of recenter it with your palms like this. So don't panic if you start to feel like you're losing control, just give it a little hug. Or if you would rather just straighten it back out, you can take one of the straight edges of a wooden tool and just gently push it into the side. Satisfying, and that will just straighten it back out. That's like my favorite part. Okay, so let's talk about shaping. The thing about shaping that you have to keep in mind is adding a curve automatically stretches the clay, and stretching the clay automatically makes it thinner, So if your walls are thin to begin with, and then you try to add a curve, it's going to get so thin that it will rip and or collapse in on itself. So, can everyone see the thickness of this? It's like a little thicker than 1/4 of an inch. That's the bare minimum of what you want to have before you start doing any shaping. If it's thinner than this, it might not be worth doing because it's just going to fall apart. So just remember to keep some thickness before you do your shaping. You know how this whole time I've been saying you want to use equal pressure with your fingers? To add a shape, now we want to use more pressure with one finger wherever we want the shape to be. So let's say we want a classic round teapot shape. I'm going to use more pressure with my non-dominant inside finger. So elbows on my legs, starting on the bottom, fingers are together, but now instead of equal pressure, I'm just going to push out ever so slightly with more pressure with my inside finger, slowly going up. And you can see slowly but surely, wherever you apply that pressure, it will start to bulge out the clay. So let's say if you are feeling super fancy that you want it to kind of curve back in on the rim. In that case, you'd use more pressure with your outside finger to push it into that position. So let's see how round we can make this. So on the bottom half, I'll continue to use more pressure with my inside finger, slowly going up. But then when I get towards the top, I'll switch to using more pressure with my outside finger. And that will push it back in. Ooh, this is where it starts to get really fun. Any questions so far about how to manipulate the shape? I will say, once you add a curve, it is hard to re-straighten it because like I said, when you add a curve, it gets thinner. So if you want it to bulge out like this, you kind of have to commit to it because you can't, I mean, again, you could, it's just really, really hard. So you guys will notice there's still a little bit of clay left on the bottom. We want to get rid of that before we take it off the wheel. So I would find any wooden tool that has a sharp corner on it, and you can use that to chop off that extra clay. So I'll get this bucket out of the way so you can see down there. There we go. Okay. Well, first I'm actually just going to draw a line to see where it bulges out. Because see how below that line it starts to go like this? Let's get rid of that. Okay. You want to use lots of water. So I'm going to stick the corner of that tool into where I just drew that line. And I'm very, very gently going to press in and down. The thing about the clay, because it's moving, sometimes the tool can get stuck in the clay and then it flies and flings across the room. We don't want to like hit anyone with our flying tools. So just make sure you have a good grip on the tool. I'm using all 5 fingers. I'm going to keep my elbow on my leg, and for balance, I'm going to hold my wrist with my other hand just to help keep it steady. I'm also going to rest it on the splash pan for extra stability as well. So taking that corner, gently pushing in, gently pushing down, and a little bit at a time, that will just take away some of the extra chunkiness from the bottom. So I'm going to do that a couple of times just to make sure I get all of it. You don't want to press too hard or too fast because, like I said, it might get stuck in the clay and then it just goes flying everywhere. So lots of water, a little bit at a time, gently pushing in, gently pushing down. So you can see that's a little thing that makes a big difference. Now it's just a bit more elegant and tapered on the bottom, and it will be less heavy. Just a little bit more. Any last minute questions as we're kind of finishing up here? Yeah.
How do you make like a lid? Like make sure it's the same
Great
size?
question. Maybe we could do a lid demo on here. Okay, perfect. So I'll show you guys how to throw a lid. Just some last minute things you want to think about with your teapot. Sometimes it actually can be really fun to have a bit of texture. So you can take some slip and kind of stick it on there. This is a little bit too wet, but you can kind of have fun with the texture. You could also do that when it's leather hard, so you'd have to do it immediately. Or if you want it to be nice and smooth, you can finish off by taking your sponge and just kind of very, very gently letting the sponge kind of roll over the clay. making sure there's no goop on the bottom. We need to make sure that the inside is dry. So you guys want to wring out your sponge, and we need to soak up all of the water from the inside. If you don't, if you leave a puddle in there, it will crack. Because the thing is, it will dry unevenly. So we want to make sure the whole thing is completely dry. And then lastly is we want to take care of the rim. You can see it kind of got really sharp. So you can take your sponge, don't push too hard, just very, very gently kind of let it levitate over that rim to make it nice and smooth. If you want your lid to fit perfectly in there, kind of nice and neat, it might be worth taking your finger and just double checking that the inside of the rim is a perfect vertical line. Vertical meaning, you know, it's straight, because if it's dented, the lid is not going to fit properly. If you want to be super fancy with it, you could even take a wooden tool and you can put that on the inside to kind of straighten it out as well. But the most important thing is that it's soft, because the thing about clay is when it gets fired, it can get very, very sharp, and we don't want to get injured drinking our tea, so just make sure it's nice and soft. Any last minute questions? Okay, so when you guys are done, you want to take the wire tool, you want to wrap it around your finger so it's nice and tight. Then you want to put your thumbs on top of the wire. Make sure your thumbs and the wire are flat on the bat. If you're not careful with this, you might cut your bottom either at a weird shape, or you might cut through the hole on the bottom. So make sure the wire is as flat as possible, and then just slide all the way across. To pick this up, what you can do is dry off your hands and make sure your hands are clean. We want to be using the bottom half of our palms at 4 o'clock and 8 o'clock. And if you wrap your fingers around and just give it a hug, and you can just pop it right up. If your piece is a little on the wetter side, I always forget what these are called, but we have this little tool here, and you can kind of scoop it up with these things. So that helps as well. I don't know why that throws me off so much. Should we talk about lids now?
Yes.
Lids is you can throw it with the flange already attached, or you can attach the flange later. Attaching the flange later is definitely the easier option, so I will show you guys how to make a lid without the flange. So when you go to make a flange, you want to use the inside measurement, but since we're going to do that later, I'm going to throw the lid to match this measurement, because that's where the lid is going to sit on top of the teapot. So you want to make sure you're happy with that measurement before you sit back down on the wheel. You can even use this tool if you're going to hand build it. It's just really helpful to get a sense of the measuring. Does the flange make sense to everybody? Okay. I know this is like a lot of random terminology. So I'll give you guys a quick recap about centering. So just pushing that down, making sure it's in the middle, smoothing it out a little bit. Lots of water. Not too fast, not too slow. So let's find a good speed here. Still a little fast, okay. So we want to keep our elbows on our legs, non-dominant hand on the side pushing in, dominant hand on the top pushing down. Equal pressure, being very gentle. Just be patient. It's going to take a couple minutes. I'm getting used to it now. You know, this is actually good to talk about too. Sometimes you might be in a situation where, can everyone see there's like all these like random waves on the bottom? Those can be super, super stubborn to get rid of. So has anyone ever heard of coning? Coning is a type of centering. It's a little bit complicated, so I'll show you guys the easier version of coning. What you do is you push the clay up, back down, over and over again, maybe like 5 to 7 times. But instead of doing full-on coning, which is really hard, I'll show you guys like the cheat sheet way to do it. A little bit faster than that. Okay. So remember how earlier I was saying you want to do equal pressure? If you have those stubborn lumps that just won't go away no matter how hard you try, you can alternate the pressure. So I'm going to use more pressure with my non-dominant hand first. I might not even use this hand for a second. So you can see it's getting skinnier and taller. After about 15 seconds or so, I'll switch to using more pressure with my top hand to push it back down and make it flatter. It's still a little lumpy, so I'm going to repeat. Using more pressure with my non-dominant hand, pushing it in and up. Nice, and then back down and out. So you can see already those annoying little lumps on the bottom are gone. They're still there a little bit, but they're a lot better. I'm also going to go back to using the top part of my palms at 6 o'clock just to help straighten it out a little bit. Nice. And then I personally am a little bit of a perfectionist, so I'm also going to take the wooden tool, my favorite part, and just straighten it out. Oh yeah. Okay. So this is obviously way more clay than we would ever possibly need for a lid, especially for a teapot this size. But the nice thing about having extra clay on the bottom is it'll give us a pedestal to work on, and you'll see what I mean by that in a second. What I'm going to do is take my finger and kind of put it maybe 2/3 down from the top and just make a little indent. So this top part is what's going to become our lid. I'm going to put the sides of my pinkies in that little notch that we made, and I'm going to put the pads of my thumbs on top. We're not pushing in with our pinkies, they're just resting there. When we put our thumbs on top, we don't want our thumbs to be touching. We want a little bit of space, because what we're about to do is create the knob, the little thing you grab on the top of the teapot. So elbows on my legs, lots of water, I'm not pushing in, they're just kind of resting there, taking my thumbs, and then gently pushing down. So you can see this is going to turn into our knob, and this will become the teapot. I mean, not the teapot, the lid. It's always safer to use more clay than you think you're going to need, because you can just chop it off. But if you don't have enough, you have to start over. So it's always, safer to have more than you think you need. So you can kind of see it taking form. So that's why the calipers are nice, because we want the rim of the lid to fit in the calipers. The thing we want to keep in mind with clay is that it is going to shrink. This clay body is going to shrink around 13%, which ends up being a couple centimeters. So keep that in mind, especially when you're making your spout, because if you make the hole too small and then it shrinks, you're not going to be able to pour anything out of it. The thing about knobs is, if your goal is to make a super functional lid that you can pick up, if the knob is super small now, and then we put it in the kiln and it gets even smaller, you're not going to be able to pick it up. So this might look ridiculously big, but remember, it's going to shrink. So don't judge me if you're thinking this is big. I'm not done though. It is a little bit wide, so I'm going to take my middle fingers and I am going to squeeze it on the bottom to kind of get more of an elegant, tapered in shape. And this is kind of a fun step because you can kind of use your fingers to play around with the type of silhouette you want. I'm just going to do a very traditional shape, so just kind of squeezing that in on the bottom there, and then making it nice and round. So you can see that'll be nice and comfortable to grab when this is done. And then, to finish off the actual lid itself, you can use your middle fingers, or your finger and your thumb. You can do this too as well, whatever's more comfortable, and just kind of pinch it or pull it to make it a little thinner, because we don't want our lid to be super thick. So you could also tilt a little bit so you can see the bottom. If your lid is getting too wide, wider than the measuring of the calipers, make that a little bit wider so you guys can see. You can take your needle tool to trim it down. So kind of put the calipers on top, lay it down so you can see the measurement. I'm going to draw a line where it should be, So I'm drawing a line for how much I need to take off. So just a couple centimeters. And then, to get that nice and wet, you want to keep your elbow on your leg, make sure you have a good grip. I'm going to rest my wrist on my palm to make sure I'm nice and stable. And I'm just going to stick that all the way through to trim off the extra clay that I don't need. And then I'm going to use my sponge to smooth off those edges. Does anyone have any questions about centering or making the lid or making the knob or the shaping of this? Does all that make sense? Okay. The fun thing about teapots is you can really get creative with your design choices. This is obviously a very traditional shape, but why not make a little sculpture and then have that be the knob? Why not make, you know, an elephant or something, and the elephant is what's in the middle of the lid? And also, you don't have to have a knob. You could have kind of a handle that goes like this. So what if you maybe braided some clay and then that was the handle? That could be really cool. You know, this is maybe too old-fashioned, and maybe this is boring, and maybe you're feeling extra creative. You could totally make something hand-built and then just stick it on there with scoring and slipping. I'm just gonna make this, I'm noticing it's kind of curving inwards. I'm just gonna tilt it down a little bit, and then we can take it off the wheel. So to take this off, I'm gonna take the wire tool, and as always, you wanna wrap it around your fingers first. I'm even gonna hold it with my thumbs to make sure I don't lose my grip. And you can just slide it underneath, because we don't need all this extra clay. The reason why we had this extra clay is so that we could shape the lid. That's the only reason why we had that, but now we can chop it off. So putting the wire tool under the lid itself, sliding all the way through. Ta-da, and there you go, you have a lid. If there's still a little bit extra underneath, you can just shave that off later. But now you can see, it just